The deputy did not want to go. He sat in his saddle on the frozen road, adjusting the shovel lashed behind the cantle leather so cold it cracked when he shifted his weight. Behind him rode three men in a sled carrying a pine box lid, not the full coffin, because a full coffin wouldn't fit flat across the saddle. Nobody spoke. The horses breathed invisible plumes that broke apart in the wind, harness metal clicking against itself as they rode west toward the river claim, where the Calloway widow had been alone since the storm buried the prairie under 6 feet of white silence. They had not come to rescue anyone. They had come to dig. Then Deputy Webb caught something on the wind, faint, impossible, carried on air that should have held nothing but cold. Bread. Fresh bread baking somewhere inside that wall of white. He pulled his horse to a stop without understanding why, and the men behind him pulled up too, and for a long moment nobody moved, because the smell of yeast rising and crust browning did not belong to a dead woman's cabin, and they all knew it. Wren Calloway had not come to Nebraska territory to die in it. She had come because her husband Daniel said the soil in Harlan County ran black and deep, because 160 acres cost nothing but 5 years of living on it, because the mountains of Tennessee had given them a hard life, but never enough land to call their own. They filed their claim in the spring of 1883 on a quarter section outside Ashford Bend, flat grass running to a bend in the Stone Creek River, where cottonwoods grew thick enough to cut, rounded stones resting in the shallows like loaves set out to cool. Daniel built the shack in 9 days, 12 feet by 16 single-wall boards, tar paper on the outside flour sacks patched over the seams where the wood shrank before the tar could hold. One window facing south. One cast iron stove with a cracked firebox plate that glowed cherry red if you fed it hard and leaked smoke if you fed it soft. One stovepipe running straight through a tin collar in the roof. The shack was not a home. It was a receipt. It proved they occupied the land, and the land would become theirs if they kept occupying it for 5 years. That was the law. The Homestead Act did not care whether a person was comfortable. It cared whether they stayed. Daniel died in November. A freight wagon loaded with fence posts overturned on an icy grade 3 miles east of town. The teamster survived with a broken collarbone. Daniel, who had been walking alongside to steady the rear axle, went under the side rail. They brought him back on the same wagon laid flat among the posts he'd been hauling for 12 cents a mile. Wren buried him on the claim. The ground had already started to freeze, so she broke the topsoil with a mattock because the shovel bounced. The grave took her 2 days. When it was done, she stood beside it with dirt packed under every fingernail and looked at what Daniel had left her. 2 hens that laid every other day. 1 milk cow whose ribs showed through her winter coat. A cracked cast iron stove. A wood pile that reached her waist and wouldn't reach her knee by the time February arrived. $11 in coin kept in a tin behind the flour bin. A stack of cottonwood boards meant for a lean-to that would never be built. The unfinished lean-to, the waiting boards, the dead man's tools still leaning against the shack wall, all of it evidence of a future that had been canceled without her consent. She had no family within 500 miles. Her parents were buried back in Tennessee. Her only sister had moved to Illinois and stopped writing the year before. There was no fare for a train even if she'd had somewhere to go, which she didn't. The claim was the only thing Daniel had left that wasn't already owed to someone. Wren Calloway was 32 years old. She had never spent a Nebraska winter alone. She didn't know how many cords of wood a single-wall shack consumed between November and March, but she was about to learn because the answer was going to walk through her door 8 days after the burial and tell her exactly what she was up against. Marshal Roy Decker arrived on a Tuesday morning. He was 54, a former freight hauler turned elected lawman, the kind of man who had survived enough hard winters to believe that survival was mostly arithmetic. He'd seen frost kill cattle standing upright in open pasture. He'd seen a man freeze to death 60 yards from his own door because the snow erased the path and the wind erased the man's sense of direction. He did not arrive at the Calloway shack carrying sympathy. He arrived because the town elders had asked him to assess whether the widow would make it through January or whether Ashford Bend should prepare to act before the ground got too hard to bury her. He stepped inside without removing his hat. His eyes moved in a specific order: stove first, then the woodpile visible through the south window, then the flour bin, then the bed where the quilt was pulled tight because there was no one to share it with anymore. He was reading the room the way a man reads a balance sheet, looking for the number that makes everything else irrelevant. How much wood have you got stacked? His voice carried no particular feeling. What's outside? Wren stood with her hands flat on the table Daniel had built, pressing down to keep them still. I looked before I knocked. That's less than a cord. Maybe a cord and a quarter if you count the green wood stacked underneath. But green wood smokes worse than it burns. He walked to the stove and held his palm near the cracked firebox plate without touching it. You need 6 cords to winter in these boards. 6 minimum. This stove eats fuel like a threshing engine because the heat travels up the pipe faster than it enters the room. Your walls have no insulation worth mentioning. Your floor has gaps wide enough to see daylight through. He pointed to the base of the south wall where the boards met the sill log. Every gap is a draft. Every draft is fuel you haven't burned yet. You're saying I'm burning wood to heat the sky. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, exactly more like recalibration. Cordwood is $2.75 a cord at the Voss yard. You cannot afford 3 cords, let alone 6. Even if you could, Voss doesn't deliver past the river after the first hard freeze because the grade is too steep for a loaded wagon on ice. He looked at the $11 she hadn't hidden well enough. You have no coal, no relatives within riding distance who've offered to take you in. No one has offered. No. He pulled his hat lower. No one has. He left without waiting for her to respond, climbed into his saddle and rode back toward Ashford Bend through a wind already pulling the warmth out of the ground. At the elders' meeting that evening, he delivered his verdict in 5 words: she will not make February. He was not cruel when he said it. He was experienced. In his experience was enough. What Decker did not know, what no one in Ashford Bend knew or thought to ask, was where Wren Calloway had come from before she came to Nebraska. She had grown up in the hill country of eastern Tennessee, in a county where the winters came down off the ridges with real weight, and the houses were built to answer them. Her father was not a farmer by trade. He was a laborer who hired himself out to craftsmen and builders, carrying hod-mixing mortar, doing what skilled men needed done so the skilled men could focus on what required skill. For 3 winters during Wren's childhood, he'd worked for an old stonemason named Hatfield, who built heating benches for the wealthier farms in the valley, thick platforms of mortared stone with fireboxes at one end and channels running beneath the surface, so smoke had to travel 20 feet before it could rise, leaving its heat in the stone along the way. She was 12 years old the first time she pressed her palm against one of Hatfield's benches an hour after the fire died. The stone was still warm. Not faintly warm, warm the way a living thing is warm, steady, giving back what the fire had put into it. Her father had a name for iron stoves borrowed from Hatfield himself. He called them chimneys with a door. All fire, no memory. The heat went in, the heat went out, and you stood beside the thing shivering unless you fed it every hour. Wren had not thought about those benches in years. In Tennessee, in the boarding house in Louisville, where she and Daniel had spent their first winter together in the rental rooms in Kearney, where they'd waited for the land filing to clear, there had always been heat she didn't have to understand. It was someone else's problem. Someone else had built it and maintained it, and she had simply been warm without thinking about why. Now it was her problem and no one else's. The realization didn't come as an idea, it came as a sensation. She woke on the 9th night after Daniel's burial to complete darkness, and a cold so thorough it had reached the water bucket beside the bed. The ice started at the surface, but she could hear it had gone through the bucket solid and silent, instead of making the faint liquid sound buckets make when you brush them in the night. The stove had gone cold 2 hours before dawn because she hadn't woken to feed it. She sat up in the dark and put her hand on the stovepipe. Still faintly warm, warmer than the air in the room, warmer than the walls, warmer than her hands. The heat hadn't disappeared. It had traveled up the pipe through the tin collar, through the roof, into the Nebraska sky where it fed nothing and warmed no one. She stood in the dark, holding her palm against the pipe, and understood something she'd known in her bones at 12 years old, and then forgotten because forgetting had been easy. The stove doesn't fail because it can't make heat. It fails because it can't keep it. She lit the lamp, sat at Daniel's table with a sheet of brown paper she'd been saving for correspondence, and drew a rectangle with 3 wavy lines running through it lengthwise, a box at one end marked with an X. Not a mason's drawing, not precise. A thinking out loud drawing, the kind you make when an idea is still more feeling than plan. The firebox at one end, 3 channels running the length beneath the surface. Smoke forced to travel horizontal before it could rise 20 feet of travel at minimum, every foot surrendering heat to the stone above it and the stone below it. A sleeping surface that stayed warm for hours after the fire died because the stone remembered what the fire had taught it. She didn't have brick, didn't have lime mortar or a mason or the money to hire one, but the Stone Creek River had rounded cobbles in the shallows, dense, heavy stones she could carry. The cut bank where the water had carved into the earth exposed gray-blue clay, so sticky it held the shape of her fingers. There was sand in the shallows. There were dried cow chips and slow grass twisted into bundles and willow brush for fuel. The same materials every poor homesteader on the Nebraska plains burned when they couldn't afford cordwood. She sat with the drawing until the lamp oil ran low. Then she put on her coat and her gloves and the canvas sling she'd sewn from a flour sack, and she walked to the river to see how heavy the good stones were. By the end of the second day of hauling, Harlan Voss had already heard about it. He was 46, the kind of man who owned the only lumber yard between Ashford Bend and the county seat, who held more freight notes and unpaid tabs than any 3 other businessmen in the territory combined. He sold cordwood at $2.75 a cord. He sold coal when he could get it freighted. He bought claims from people who couldn't hold them, improved them just enough to prove residency, then sold them to newcomers at 3 times the filing cost. Daniel Calloway's freight note sat in Voss's ledger at $31 payment for hauling lumber and fence posts through the fall. If Wren abandoned the claim, the note became uncollectible. If she sold to cover the debt, Voss would own Riverbend acreage for the cost of wages he'd essentially already written off. Either outcome was acceptable. A widow building something out of river rock in a board shack was a woman burning daylight she didn't have, and every day she wasted brought her claim one day closer to resolution. He arrived on a Saturday with 2 men she recognized from the lumber yard, not for muscle, she understood immediately, but for witness. He produced the note, folded once, held it where she could see the figures without taking it. He spoke about the debt, about her $11, about his offer, the claim for the balance of the note, plus $5, which gave her $36 free and clear. Enough for a train east, enough for a month's board wherever she landed. Wren looked at the note. She looked at the 2 witnesses brought along so they could repeat her answer to anyone who asked. The claim isn't for sale, Mr. Voss. His smile didn't change, but the temperature behind it did. A woman building a bed out of rocks, he said loud enough for both witnesses, has already lost her senses. He folded the note back into his coat. When the cold decides for you, the offer will be lower. He turned and walked back to his wagon. The witnesses followed. Wren stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her jaw locked shut, because if she opened her mouth, she would say things that gave him ammunition, and she couldn't afford ammunition in anyone else's hands right now. She watched the wagon until it rounded the tree line. Then she closed the door, picked up the canvas sling, and walked back to the river. Decker returned 2 days later. He didn't come inside this time. He stood at the edge of the area where she'd pulled up 3 floorboards to expose the earth beneath, looking at the growing pile of river stones against the shack's east wall. He crouched and pressed his thumb into the exposed soil. It sank to the second knuckle before meeting resistance. The ground is frozen 2 inches down, Wren told him. Below that, the clay is soft. I'm laying a pad of flat stones and clay, first 3 inches of base, then I build up from there. Where did you learn masonry? I didn't learn masonry. My father worked for a man who built stone heating benches. I watched when I was a girl. I'm trying to build something smaller than what he built using what the river gives me. Decker stood and wiped his thumb on his coat. He looked at the pile of stones, at the torn-up floor, at the woman who was 32 years old and doing something no one in Harlan County had ever seen done. That bench your father watched being built, how many men built it? She didn't answer. The answer was that Hatfield had worked with 2 assistants over the better part of a week, and she knew what Decker would do with that information. He nodded, reading her silence the way experienced men read silences. You're building a multiple-man job alone in a structure that may not take the weight with uncut stone using clay you dug from a riverbank. He looked at her with something that wasn't contempt, closer to the exhausted patience of a man who had watched too many people die of optimism. I hope I'm wrong, Mrs. Calloway. I've been wrong before. A pause. Not about winter, though. He left. The wind moved in behind him like it had been waiting just outside. That night, Wren lay on the remaining floorboards beside the pit she'd dug for the foundation pad and counted the things she didn't know how to do. She didn't know how to build a proper flue. She didn't know how to seal clay so it wouldn't crack under sustained heat. She didn't know how to prevent smoke from backing into the room when the wind shifted wrong. She didn't know how to build a chimney that would pull in a crosswind. She didn't know any of these things, and not knowing any single one of them could fill the shack with smoke and kill her in her sleep. She needed someone who understood drafting clay and the way heat moved through stone. She needed that person before the weather closed the last window. What she didn't know was that the person was 3 miles north, living in a dugout on a quarter section that backed up to a dry creek bed and had already heard about the widow hauling stones from the river. The next morning, Wren cleared a 7 by 6 foot rectangle of earth 2 feet inside the south wall and began fitting flat stones into the exposed clay. She worked on her knees, pressing each stone level filling gaps with a clay and sand mixture she'd carried up from the riverbank in a bucket. By noon, her back had locked into a single continuous ache, and her fingers had cracked at the joints from the wet cold. She hauled stone in the afternoons. The route ran 1.5 miles downhill to the river on frozen grass and 1.5 miles back uphill, dragging a makeshift sled she'd built from Daniel's lean-to boards, with rope runners threaded through holes she'd burned with a hot nail. Each trip brought 40 to 60 pounds. 3 trips before dark, 120 to 180 pounds a day. She needed 2,000. She did the math every night. The math never improved. By the end of the first week, she had 400 pounds of stone inside the shack and a base pad that covered half the rectangle. The cracked stove still heated the room barely, but every board she'd removed from the floor let more cold seep up from the earth below. She was making the shack colder in order to build something that might make it warmer. And the gap between those two states was filled with nothing but faith and labor and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had no other options that didn't involve leaving. Her hands split at the knuckles. The blood froze in the cracks before it could scab, so she wrapped the splits in strips torn from one of Daniel's spare shirts and kept hauling. The cow stopped giving milk on the 4th day, cold or poor feed, or the stress of the changed routine. She couldn't tell, but the milk pail stayed empty. She ate sourdough and boiled oats and the pickled beets her neighbor Sigrid Holt had left without much comment the week before. And she lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. At the lumberyard in Ashford Bend, Voss told anyone who'd listen. He didn't need to exaggerate. The facts were sufficient. A woman alone pulling stones from a frozen river, tearing up her own floor building, something out of clay that no one in the territory had ever seen attempted. She's building herself a tomb with a chimney, he told the men at the yard, and the laughter spread the way. Laughter always spreads in a small place outward in every direction, reaching eventually the people it was designed to reach. Wren heard about it from Sigrid Holt, who rode over on a gray mare with a face that said she'd argued with herself the whole way about whether to mention it. Wren didn't cry that night. She packed more rags into the worst gaps along the north wall base, tallied her stone count in the lamplight, calculated how many days at her current pace before she had enough for the channels, and went to sleep. She was on her knees pressing stones into clay on the 9th day of hauling when the shadow fell across the entrance of the pit, longer than the shack, because the afternoon sun came in low, and the woman standing at the edge was tall enough in her stillness to seem taller than she was. She came from the north on foot, wrapped in a coat that had been mended so many times it had lost any original color canvas bag over one shoulder, walking with the measured pace of someone who had decided on a destination before leaving and saw no reason to hurry now that she'd arrived. She stopped at the edge of the turned earth. She looked at the pit, the stones, the half-finished base pad, the growing pile of river rocks sorted roughly by size against the east wall. Then she looked at the drawing Wren had scratched into the frozen clay beside the door frame, the rectangle with 3 wavy lines and the X-mark box at the foot end. She studied the drawing for a long time. "Your channels are too narrow." Her voice carried the flat directness of someone who had stopped bothering with preamble. Wren sat back on her heels and looked up. She saw a face that was old but not fragile 60, maybe beyond that cheekbones catching the late light eyes, already reading the shack the way Decker had read it. The difference was that this woman wasn't reading for failure. She was reading for what was salvageable. Who are you? Dorothea Marsh. Most people say Dot. She set the canvas bag down and crouched beside the drawing. My husband laid stone for 25 years in Pennsylvania. I mixed his mortar, held his line, and learned everything he didn't think I was paying attention to. She touched the drawing with one finger. This isn't a stove, but it wants to be one. Your instinct about the horizontal travel is right. Your channel width will kill the draft. You know about heating benches. I know about any structure where fire and stone have to come to an agreement. She straightened, looking at the pit. Can you build this alone? I'm building it alone right now. You're digging a foundation. Building it is different. She picked up the canvas bag. I can teach you what I know. I won't build it for you. My hands aren't good for that work anymore, and you need to understand it yourself, or the first thing that goes wrong in a storm, you'll have no idea how to fix. She moved toward the doorway of the shack and paused with her hand on the frame. The channels need to be wider. We start there. Wren got up from her knees and followed her inside. The lamp was already burning against the early dark. The cracked stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen grass with a sound like something rehearsing. Somewhere in the territory, the temperature was already dropping toward the numbers that would make everything that happened in this shack either sufficient or fatal. But for the first time since she'd stood beside a mound of frozen earth with dirt under her fingernails, Wren Calloway was not entirely alone with the problem. Dot's first lesson had nothing to do with stone. She lit a candle stub from her coat pocket. She carried them the way other women carried pins as a matter of habit and held the flame near the cold stovepipe. The fire in the stove had been dead for hours. The candle flame leaned toward the pipe, wavered, then bent sideways as a draft pushed through a gap in the wallboards. Watch the chimney, not the candle. Dot held the flame steady. The air inside that pipe is cold. Cold air is heavier than warm air, so it sits in the pipe like a cork in a bottle. You light a fire beneath it, the smoke pushes up, meets the cold column, loses the argument. The smoke comes back into the room. She moved the candle closer until the flame steadied against the pipe's pull. If you're awake, you open a door. If you're asleep, you don't wake up. Wren had already understood this in theory from the night with the frozen bucket. What she hadn't known was how to prevent it. So how do you start it safely? You prime the chimney first. A twist of dry grass lit and held at the base of the flue. The heat rises fast, pulls the cold air up with it, and the draft reverses before you ever load the firebox. Once it's drawing, it wants to keep drawing. But if the wind shifts, or the chimney cools, or a channel narrows from buildup, it can reverse mid-burn. Dot blew out the candle and put it back in her pocket. You'll build a bypass gap between the firebox and the base of the chimney, a loose stone you can remove. If the draft fails while there's fire in the box, you open the bypass. The heat vents low, you reestablish the draw, you seal it again. Her eyes moved to Wren's. You will never close a damper while there is flame in the firebox. Not once. Not even if the room is full of smoke. Especially not then. My father never mentioned any of this. Your father watched a man who had already solved these problems. The solutions are invisible when they work. Dot moved to the window and looked at the stone pile outside. We begin from nothing. That's the honest place to start. The second lesson came the following afternoon, and it required patience Wren didn't feel she had time for. Dot selected 2 stones from the pile without explaining her criteria. One thin and flat, no thicker than 2 stacked fingers, and one dense river cobble the size of a man's fist. She set both stones beside the stove on the flat hearthstone, then added wood to the firebox and told Wren to feed it hot for 30 minutes. Not a smolder or burn, the kind that makes the iron glow. 30 minutes later, Dot touched the thin stone, then gestured for Wren to do the same. Hot, nearly too hot to hold a hand near. Now the cobble. Barely warm. Less than the room had been before the fire started. Wren frowned, ready to argue, but Dot shook her head once. They waited. Wren cleaned mortar tools, sorted the small stones she'd set aside for channel walls, counted her fuel bundles for the third time that week. An hour passed. The fire died to coals. The coals faded to gray. Dot gestured at the thin stone. Cold, same as the floor. The cobble, when Wren pressed her palm to it, pushed warmth back against her skin. Not a blaze, not dramatic, but real steady heat moving outward from the stone's core, as though the fire hadn't ended but simply moved inside. The thin stone as every iron stove ever built. Dot hefted the cobble and turned it in her hands, studying it the way you study something you respect. It takes heat fast because there's not much of it to move through. It gives heat fast for the same reason. Then it's done, and you go get more wood. She set the cobble back on the hearthstone. Your platform must be thick. The channels need mass above them, below them, on both sides. The smoke passes through and bleeds its heat into the stone. The stone carries that heat all night, giving it back slowly the way a good debt gets paid steady, without drama, every obligation met. Wren pressed her hand to the cobble again, still warm. The fire had been out for over an hour. This was what she remembered from Hatfield's benches in Tennessee. This was the thing she'd felt at 12 years old, and filed away without knowing she was filing it, that warmth coming back from stone long after the wood was ash. She'd been trying to rebuild a memory. Dot was handing her the principle behind it. How thick does the platform need to be? As thick as you can build while still leaving yourself room to move through the door. The third lesson nearly cost Wren a third of her stone pile. Dot went through every stone she'd hauled and began dividing them. One group she accepted without comment, a second group she set aside, a third group she walked outside with and set against the far wall of the shack away from the building area. 14 stones rejected before she passed one. Her method looked like ritual. She held each stone near her ear and tapped it with a knuckle, listening to the sound it made. Solid, dense stones produced a clean knock. Others produced something flatter, more muffled. Those went to the reject pile. 2 stones she dropped into a bucket of water she'd brought in from the pump, and both produced a slow chain of bubbles rising from invisible pores. Those have water in them, not surface water, water that's been absorbed into the structure. She fished them out and set them aside. Heat the stone, the water becomes steam. The steam expands faster than the stone can accommodate. Maybe it cracks slowly and you lose a channel wall. Maybe it cracks in a second and throws a piece of hot rock into whoever's nearest. She looked at Wren. Only dense stone. No cracks visible or suspected, no pores. If you're uncertain, it goes in the discard pile. There are more stones in that river. The mortar lesson came next, and the proportions mattered more than anything else so far. Too much clay in the mix, and it would shrink and crack when the heat hit it. Too much sand, and it crumbled under load. The chopped straw held the mixture together while it cured, gave it tensile quality the other materials lacked. Dot tested consistency by taking a handful and squeezing it. If the shape held and the straw fibers showed on the surface, without the mass breaking apart, the ratio was right. The clay shield along the south wall required its own instruction. Where the platform would come within 2 feet of the board wall, Dot marked a line 6 inches out from the wall surface. Packed clay, not mortared, 6 inches thick with an air gap between the back of the clay and the boards. She pressed her point with the particular firmness of someone who had seen what happens when this is skipped. The wood wall must never touch hot stone through any continuous material. Not clay, not mortar, not packed earth. Air between them. Always. A pause. The men in town who think you've lost your mind would enjoy being right about the fire. Construction ate the rest of December with a regularity that started to feel like something Wren could lean against. She hauled stone mornings, built afternoons, reviewed the day's work with Dot in the evenings when Dot came, which wasn't every day. Dot came when the work warranted it, arriving at dusk to inspect mortar joints by lamplight, pressing a thin stick into the lines to check for hidden gaps, tapping every channel stone before it was fully set. When the work was right, she didn't appear. When something was wrong, she materialized at the doorway like a consequence. The third time Dot ordered a section demolished and rebuilt, Wren was on her knees in the pit with clay under her nails, and the particular exhaustion that comes from working beyond your body's reasonable requests. I've pulled this section twice. You'll pull it a third time if the joint isn't right. Bad masonry doesn't fail on a schedule. It fails whenever it chooses, could be the first burn, could be the first hard wind that gets the chimney pulling at full draw. Dot crouched to examine the offending joint, then stood. A crooked stone at the base becomes a collapsed channel at the top. A collapsed channel means smoke with nowhere to go. I don't need to finish that sentence. You finished it 4 times this week. Because you keep needing to hear it. But something in Dot's voice had shifted almost imperceptibly, not softer exactly, but less impersonal. She'd stopped talking to a stranger who was making dangerous mistakes. She'd started talking to someone she was invested in not losing. They disagreed about speed all the way through. Wren wanted stone laid fast, sealed fast, the project moving toward completion before weather closed every window of opportunity. Dot wanted each joint tested, each stone listened to each channel wall measured for plumb before the next course went on. The distance between right and soon was measured in days Wren didn't have, and the argument lived between them like a third occupant of the shack necessary, uncomfortable, never resolved. Winter doesn't wait for good masonry, Wren said one evening, not for the first time. Dot's answer didn't change either. Bad masonry doesn't wait for winter. By late November, Wren had hauled 1 ton of stone. Dot made her keep the count on the cabin wall, each sled load estimated before unloading the number scratched with a nail into the wood above the doorframe. When the tally crossed 2,000 pounds, Wren allowed herself one evening a feeling like the worst was behind her. Good, Dot said, studying the wall. Now you need another 1,000 for the chimney and the capstones. The silence that followed was not the kind that gets filled easily. You didn't mention that before. You didn't ask what the full requirement was. You asked how much for the platform. Dot moved to the window, looking out at the stone pile that seemed simultaneously enormous and insufficient. The chimney needs mass too, or it'll cool too fast in high wind, and the draft will fail. The capstones need to be the best material you've hauled dense flat, as close to uniform thickness as the river gives you. They take the direct heat from the channel's longest. The river shallows froze on the 28th of November. Not gradually overnight, a skin of ice that thickened by morning into something that required an axe. The good stone the dense rounded cobble Dot had approved on the first pass lay under 3 inches of ice that had to be chopped through on both knees in mud that was freezing around her boots while she worked. She pulled 11 stones that day. Her usual count was 20 or more. The cow had stopped giving milk weeks earlier. The hens were laying every 3rd day now, sometimes every 4th. The $11 had become 7 after salt lamp oil, and a pound of coffee she rationed to half a cup each morning because the warmth of it was the only thing that made the first hour of work possible. She ate what she had and tried not to calculate how much weight she was losing because the number would only confirm what she already knew and couldn't do anything about. Dot brought food when she came, not as charity, which Wren would have refused, but framed as barter. Boiled eggs against leftover mortar for patching Dot's dugout walls. Dried meat against the use of Wren's bucket for a morning. The trades were unequal in Dot's favor by a significant margin, and both women knew it, and neither acknowledged it, because the pretending was a form of dignity they were both extending. Sigrid Holt arrived on Christmas Eve with her 2 oldest boys. Eric was 14 and Lars was 12, big for their ages, from 3 years of frontier labor. And they came with a stone boat, a flat wooden sled built for dragging fieldstone behind a horse, which was how the Holt family had cleared their own acreage of the worst rocks. The draft horse stood in the yard breathing steam while the boys unloaded equipment and looked at the inside of the shack with the wide eyes of children who had heard their mother's warnings for weeks and were now seeing the thing those warnings had been about. Sigrid didn't explain why she'd come. She looked at Wren's hands wrapped in cloth strips that had gone brown with old blood at Wren's face, which was thinner than it had been when they'd last spoken at the platform rising inside the shack, like something that couldn't quite decide whether it was furniture or architecture. The boys will haul flat stone from the river for 3 days, Sigrid said. After that, I need them home. Wren started to say something that began with gratitude. Sigrid stopped her with a look. Don't. I'm not doing this because I believe in what you're building. I'm doing it because you're going to injure yourself hauling alone, and then I'll have to explain to my children why I watched it happen. She glanced at the boys. 3 days. Flat stone only Dot Marsh can tell them what she'll accept. She was right about Eric. On the first trip, he came back with 23 stones, and Dot approved 19 of them, which was a better ratio than Wren had achieved after weeks of practice. Lars was slower but stronger, and he could manage loads that would have taken Wren 2 trips. In 3 days, they brought enough flat stone to cap all 3 channels. Wren set each capstone herself. She tapped every one before it went down the way Dot had taught her, listening for the clean knock that meant density rejecting any stone that spoke in a flat dead tone. She pressed clay mortar into every joint with her thumb, ran the thin stick through each line to check the depth of penetration. Dot watched the final stones go on without speaking until the last one was seated. "It's ugly," Dot said. "It's closed." Closed and finished are different things. Finished is what it becomes after the first winter. The platform was complete on January 8, 1884. It filled half the cabin, occupied the space with the ungainly authority of something built for survival rather than comfort. 3 mortar patches marked where the clay had cracked during curing. Wren had filled them immediately when Dot pointed them out, and they'd held on the second attempt. The paths around it were 18 inches on the south side, 2 feet on the north, where the old iron stove still stood in service, until the new system proved itself. The firebox door, a salvaged iron plate from a ruined cook stove too wide for the opening by 1.5 inches, the gap sealed with packed clay that cracked a little each time she opened it, faced the foot end of the sleeping surface. The chimney rose through a new hole cut in the east wall, lined with packed clay, fitted with a salvaged stovepipe section for the final 2 feet where it exited the shack. She fired it that evening. Willow sticks and tight-rolled hay twists. Nothing elaborate, a hot charge to test the draft before committing to a full burn. Dot held her candle near the clean-out gap at the first channel turn. The flame bent toward the gap. Air was moving. They watched smoke thread through the first channel round the turn, enter the second. At the far end of the second channel, a thin gray seam appeared at a mortar joint. Wren hadn't packed thoroughly enough. Dot marked it with a thumb of wet clay. The smoke continued into the third channel, slower now. Cooler, its heat surrendering to the stone it passed through. It rose through the side bell chamber into the chimney stub and out. It drew. The channels held. The mortar didn't crack. Then it stopped drawing. The chimney stub, 4 feet tall, unlined, exposed to full wind, cooled in a gust from the northwest. The draft reversed. Smoke pushed back through the bell chamber, through the third channel, into the room, as a gray, rolling wave that hit Wren at face level and drove her toward the door with burning eyes before she'd processed what was happening. Dot was already moving, pulling the clean-out stone at the first turn to vent smoke low, then grabbing Wren's arm and hauling her outside into air that was 12 degrees and felt in that moment like mercy. They stood in the yard, coughing, eyes streaming while smoke poured from the open shack door. "The chimney is too short." Dot's voice was hoarse but flat, not alarmed, just diagnostic. The wind caught it broadside. "You need 2 more feet of stacked clay liner inside a capstone on 4 small legs, so rain and snow can't enter, while exhaust can still escape." Wren's lungs felt scraped. "I nearly died." "Yes." A pause. "Now you know what draft failure looks like from the inside. You won't mistake it for anything else." Voss heard about the smoke by evening naturally. The story traveled from the general store where Dot had stopped for stovepipe wire, said nothing explanatory, and left to the lumberyard where the men who'd been watching this situation with amusement for 2 months now had fresh material. Wren was told about Voss's comment secondhand, the way all such things travel in small places, slightly sharpened by each retelling. She didn't cry that night. She rebuilt the chimney the next 2 days, 2 additional feet of stacked stone, clay liner packed in courses, the capstone seated on 4 small legs, exactly as Dot had specified. The second test burn drew clean. The third drew clean in a crosswind. The fourth drew clean when Dot stood outside in the cold and threw handfuls of snow at the chimney opening to simulate driven precipitation. The draft didn't waver. Decker came on January 9th. He stepped inside and stood near the door, hat on, looking at the platform the way a man looks at arithmetic that doesn't resolve the way he expected. He walked to it, put his palm flat on the surface, and left it there. The stone was warm, not residually warm from the morning fire, warm the way something is warm that has been collecting heat for days and releasing it at a rate the room can use. "How long has it been like this?" Since I finished the capstones, Wren stood near the firebox. I fire it morning and evening. Short burns, hot fuel. The channels are 21 feet of horizontal travel. The smoke gives most of its heat to the stone before it reaches the chimney. By midnight, the surface is still warm enough to sleep on without added blankets. The water bucket next to it hasn't frozen in 3 nights. Decker kept his hand on the stone. The outline of his palm left a mark in the thin flour dust on the surface when he finally lifted it. He looked at the south wall, still single-wall boards, still patched with flour, sacking, still breathing cold air through every crack when the wind pushed. "The real test isn't a calm night," he said, not unkindly. "It's what happens when the wind decides to make an argument out of it." He left without delivering a verdict. For Wren, that absence of condemnation was the closest thing to encouragement she'd received from him since November, and she understood it for what it was, not approval, but the acknowledgement that the arithmetic had gotten more complicated than he'd initially calculated. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. The sky to the northwest had the particular yellow-gray quality that experienced plains people recognize as a held breath. 3 days later, it would exhale. But on the evening of January 9th, Wren Calloway sat beside the warm stone platform in a shack that everyone in Ashford Bend still considered a coffin, eating sourdough bread she'd baked using heat stored in 2 tons of riverstone, and waited for the test that would make all the other tests irrelevant. The morning of January 12th, 1884 arrived warm. Not seasonably mild warm in a way that felt like an error. 34 degrees at dawn, climbing past 40 by 10 o'clock. The snow on the south-facing roof began to drip. Ice cracked in the bends of Stone Creek River with sounds like distant rifle shots. The hens scratched at patches of thawed ground near the shack's east wall, confused by the sudden generosity of the earth. A wagon moved somewhere on the county road, its wheels audible for the first time in weeks. Wren didn't trust it. She couldn't have explained the feeling precisely. She had no barometer, no formal knowledge of weather systems, no experience reading the particular pressure shifts that preceded the worst plainstorms. What she had was a body that had spent 2 months learning to pay attention, and her body told her that warmth in January on the Nebraska plains was not a gift freely given. It was interest on a debt that hadn't come due yet. She fired the platform hard that morning, a double load of willow sticks packed tight in the firebox, followed by compressed hay twists that burned hot enough to make the iron door tick with expansion. She stacked 3 extra fuel bundles inside the door where she could reach them without going out. She filled both water buckets at the pump while the pump still moved freely. She brought the cow inside, tying her near the old iron stove in the corner where the animal's body heat would add something to the room's thermal account. By 2 in the afternoon, the debt came due. The temperature dropped the way a stone drops, not gradually, not with warning, but as though warmth had simply been revoked. 40 degrees became 30, then 20. Then the thermometer Daniel had nailed beside the door was falling past numbers Wren didn't want to read. The wind arrived from the northwest in a single gust that shook the shack on its foundation and didn't stop. It wasn't wind in any usual sense. It was the air itself turning into something else. Fine, dry snow driven horizontal at a velocity that erased the distinction between ground and sky, between near and far, between the yard and the end of the world. The pump disappeared, 20 feet from the door gone. The world contracted to the interior of a 12 by 16-foot shack and the 2 tons of stone inside it. The first crisis arrived within 20 minutes of the storm's onset. Wind hit the chimney broadside from the northwest and drove cold air down the flue in a hard pulse. Smoke back through the bell chamber, through the third channel, seeping into the room as a gray film that stung Wren's eyes before she'd fully registered what was happening. Not the catastrophic reversal of the December failure, a seep, a warning, the chimney losing ground to pressure it hadn't been tested against. She remembered the bypass gap. Dot had insisted on it during construction, a loose stone between the firebox chamber and the chimney base that Wren had considered optional until this moment. She pulled it free, exposing a direct path from firebox to chimney base, then lit a twist of dry hay and held it at the opening. The flame shot upward, hot air punching through the column of cold that had stalled in the stack. The chimney coughed. She felt it more than heard it. A pressure shift then drew. Smoke reversed course, moving the right direction again. She sealed the bypass, fed the firebox a measured charge. Hot, fast, controlled. The rule Dot had drilled into her through weeks of repetition. Hot fire produces heat that moves quickly through the channels. Slow fire produces smoke that lingers and deposits creosote on every surface it touches. She ran the system the way it was designed to run. The stone beneath her hand was already warm from the morning burn. It would hold. 40 minutes into the storm, someone knocked on the door. Not wind doesn't knock with that rhythm, that desperate, uneven cadence. Wren unlatched the door, and the storm tore it from her grip, driving snow into the room in a horizontal sheet that covered the floor in seconds. A shape fell through the opening, small, ice-crusted, barely able to hold itself upright against the force of what had pushed it here. Marta Holt, 9 years old, Sigrid's youngest daughter. Her mittens frozen into rigid fists, her eyelashes white, her face carrying the slack expression that Wren recognized as dangerous. Not panic, not pain, but the terrible quietude of a body that has begun negotiating with cold instead of fighting it. She had been on a sled returning from a neighbor's claim 2 miles east when the storm hit. The sled lurched over a drift. Marta fell off the back. The snow swallowed her before anyone could turn around. She had moved by instinct, walking when she could, crawling when she couldn't, until she hit the east wall of the shack with her shoulder and followed the boards to the door. Wren dragged her inside, leaned her whole weight against the door to force it shut against the wind, drove the iron bar through the latch bracket. The room temperature had dropped 15 degrees in under a minute. Snow covered the floor in a white layer already beginning to melt from the warmth radiating off the platform. She stripped the frozen outer layers from the child without ceremony, coat, scarf, mittens, boots, each garment stiff as cast iron. The girl's fingers were white to the second knuckle. Her feet were white. She wasn't crying, which was the most alarming thing. Children in genuine cold distress cry until they can't, and then they go quiet, and quiet is the wrong direction. Wren lifted her onto the platform. The stone surface was warm from the morning's double charge, and the evening burn she'd completed 2 hours before the storm arrived. She pulled the quilt over the child, then pressed her own body against Marta's back, adding heat the only way a human body can add it, directly through contact. She reached for the loose bricks she kept stacked near the firebox and set 2 on the channel surface, where the heat ran closest to the top. Within minutes, they were warm. She wrapped them in cloth strips, pressed one against Marta's feet, one against her abdomen. She fed the firebox again. The stone ate the heat. Marta's fingers went from white to mottled red over the next 20 minutes, and then the child made a sound that was not a word, but was better than silence. And then she began to cry. The pain of blood returning to flesh that has started to die is worse than the cold that emptied it. And Wren held the girl through it, talking steadily, not reassurances exactly, but information. Stay awake. Don't sleep yet. The hurting means your body is taking it back. The second crisis built through the night. Snow packed against the north wall in a drift that climbed past the window level by midnight, its weight pressing against the door with increasing insistence. The latch bracket held, but the door itself had begun to bow slightly inward at the base, a quarter-inch of give that hadn't been there before. If the drift sealed the door completely, they would lose the ventilation. The door gaps provided small amounts, but the chimney draw depended on air entering the room from somewhere. Seal every gap and the fire suffocates, the draft fails. The channels fill with smoke that has nowhere to go. Wren tied a length of rope from the base stone of the platform to the door's iron bracket, keeping tension on it so the door couldn't be pushed inward by incremental drift pressure. Then she took the bread peel, the flat wooden paddle she used to move loaves on the platform surface, and began working snow away from the interior threshold, scooping it through the gap at the door's base, packing it against the interior wall where it would melt slowly in the residual warmth instead of accumulating against the door's outside face. She worked for an hour. The drift rebuilt itself in 20 minutes. She worked again. The wind had patience she couldn't match. She had a bread peel. But she also had 2 tons of stone that had been absorbing heat since morning stone that would keep the room at a survivable temperature for hours without any additional fire. And that meant she could work in intervals, resting on the warm platform beside Marta, between rounds of excavation, letting the stone do what stone does while she conserved the energy she had left. She counted fuel bundles during one of these intervals. 14 at the storm's start, down to 9 now. She had stacked cottonwood boards from Daniel's unfinished lean-to near the firebox. As a last reserve, she'd resisted burning them for months, as though using them meant accepting the lean-to would never be built, as though Daniel's unfinished intentions deserved to be preserved. She looked at them in the firebox light for a long moment. Then she moved them closer. Marta woke around midnight and said she was hungry. Wren gave her bread, the loaf she'd baked 3 days earlier, using residual heat from an afternoon burn set on the platform surface and covered with the clay pot Dot had left for exactly that purpose. The bread was dense dark, flavored with the particular sourness that comes from a starter kept warm on stone for weeks. The child ate slowly, holding the bread carefully, her fingers still swollen and tender, as though her hands had been lent to someone else for a while, and she was relearning how to use them. The near-fatal moment came at dawn of the second day. Wren heard it before she identified it, a metallic rhythm, fast, sharp, the stovepipe joint at the point where the channel's exit met the chimney base, vibrating in a wind that had shifted east overnight. The joint was sealed with packed clay and wrapped wire, the same construction that had held through 3 test burns in 2 minor wind events. What it hadn't held through was 36 hours of sustained assault from a storm that had not paused or softened in any measurable way. The clay was crumbling. She could see it from across the room, small fragments falling away with each vibration, the wire wrap still holding. But the seal it was meant to reinforce, disappearing piece by piece. If the joint opened completely, this was not a draft failure. This was a breach. Carbon monoxide from a compromised flue in an enclosed room with no ventilation path would reach lethal concentration before either of them woke from sleep to notice. She climbed onto the platform. The stone surface was hot enough through the fabric of her dress to register as pain immediately, the channels below running at their highest thermal load from the extended burn she'd been maintaining. She moved on her knees to the joint, reached it, saw the gap already forming at the upper edge, where the clay had lost half its depth. The cloth wraps on her hands were too thick to work into the gap. She unwound them. She pressed bare clay into the breach with her bare fingers, working it around the pipe's circumference, feeling the heat radiating from the stone beneath her knees and the heat from the pipe itself. The joint vibrated. Clay cracked along the line she'd just filled. She pressed more in, holding pressure with both thumbs, trying to force it to depth before the next vibration shook it loose. The pipe lurched. Her right wrist came down on the surface of the chimney-base stone, not a graze, a full impact. The bone of her wrist meeting stone that had been absorbing channel heat for 2 days straight. The pain arrived as a white line drawn from wrist to elbow, immediate total. She didn't pull back. She kept her left hand on the clay, pressing, holding the seal, while her right hand located more clay from the bucket and fed it in. The joint vibrated twice more, smaller oscillations, then steadied as the new clay found its depth and the wire wrap distributed the remaining stress. She rolled off the platform onto the floor. Her right wrist had already begun to blister, a welt rising in the lamplight, the skin beneath it, the color of a late sunset. She pressed a wet cloth against it and stayed on the floor for several minutes, breathing. Marta's voice came from the platform above her. "Is it fixed?" Wren looked at her wrist, looked at the joint which was holding the chimney, drawing steadily, smoke moving the right direction. "It's fixed." A pause. "Go back to sleep." The storm broke on the morning of the third day. Not in one motion, the wind decreased in stages from its sustained roar to a moan, from a moan to an intermittent gust, from gust to silence. The silence was almost harder to process than the noise had been. Wren sat on the platform edge for several minutes, just listening to it before she moved. She had to dig from inside to open the door. 20 minutes with the bread peel working at the base, clearing the packed drift that had settled against it overnight. When it finally swung free, cold air entered in a rush that dropped the room temperature sharply, but the stone held. The platform had been fired at first light, a final charge of the last of the hay twists, and the channels were full of stored heat that would bleed into the room through the afternoon, regardless of what the outside air was doing. She stood in the open doorway with flour on her sleeve from the dough she'd been working when the door finally moved. Behind her, Marta sat on the warm platform, wrapped in the quilt, eating the crust of a loaf that had baked overnight in residual stone heat. On the shelf beside the platform, 4 loaves cooled in a row she had baked through the second night because the act of baking required a system that was working, channels that were drawing stone that was holding. And as long as she could bake, she could prove to herself that the system hadn't failed. A woman who can bake bread in a blizzard is not living in a coffin. The prairie outside was unrecognizable. The drifts had sculpted the land into shapes that bore no relationship to the ground beneath them. The pump was buried. The lean-to frame had collapsed under snow weight. Every fence post had vanished. The only mark of human occupation visible from the doorway was the shack itself sitting in its own drift, the clay chimney trailing a thin line of smoke into clearing air. They came on January 29th, 2 weeks after the storm. The morning was cold enough to crack harness leather when the horses moved Deputy Webb in front because he'd drawn the short straw. Decker behind him, a farmer named Caldwell, who'd brought a canvas death sheet, and Harlan Voss, who hadn't been asked but had saddled up anyway, because an unclaimed widow's land was the kind of thing a man like Voss wanted to be present for when it resolved. They brought shovels. They brought a pine box lid lashed flat to the sled because a full coffin wouldn't lay across a saddle. 2 miles out, Webb stopped his horse. The chimney on the Callaway claim was drawing. A thin line of gray rising straight in the still air. No wind to pull it sideways, just smoke going up from a fire that required a living hand to tend it. A dead woman's shack produces cold and silence. It does not produce smoke. Voss saw it first. He didn't speak. Decker saw it a moment later, kicked his horse forward without comment, the sled scraping behind him over the crusted snow. They reached the shack. Decker dismounted before the others walked to the door, removed his glove to knock. From inside came a sound that stopped his hand mid-motion, the crack and settle of a bread crust cooling on a shelf. He knocked. The door opened. Wren Callaway stood in the frame, thinner than any of them remembered, her dress loose at the shoulders, her left hand on the door frame for steadiness, her right wrist wrapped in flour sacking stained brown where the burn had wept through. She looked at the 4 men, looked at the shovels, looked at the pine box lid on the sled. "You brought a coffin." Her voice carried no particular feeling. It was an observation, not an accusation. No one answered. Behind her, Marta Holt rose from the platform, pale, thinner than a 9-year-old should be, favoring her left foot, where frostbite had taken sensation from 2 toes, but standing. Alive. In a shack that should have held 2 frozen bodies. Decker stepped inside. He didn't look at Wren. He walked directly to the platform, put his palm flat on the surface. Held it there. The stone was warm, not residually warm from a recent fire. Warm the way a living thing is warm, steady, radiating from its core, the heat of a system that had been running for weeks and had no intention of stopping. He kept his hand there for a long time. When he lifted it, the print of his palm remained in the thin flour dust on the stone surface. He looked at the firebox door, the clay chimney, the narrow paths around the platform's edge, the fuel pile in the corner still more than a third full after 3 days of the worst storm in memory. "I called this shack a coffin." He wasn't speaking to Wren. He was speaking to the room, to the stone, to the verdict he'd delivered 2 months earlier and had been carrying since as a kind of debt. "I was wrong. This was the only house out here built for what came." Voss stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, not entering. He looked at the 4 loaves cooling on the shelf, bread, baked by heat, stored in stone by fire, that had ended hours before the bread began. He looked at it the way a man looks at evidence he cannot refute, but does not want to incorporate into his understanding of the world. He turned, walked back to his horse, mounted, said nothing. They brought Marta home that afternoon, wrapped in Wren's quilt on the sled. Sigrid saw them coming from the window and came out of the house without her coat, without boots, running through snow that reached her thighs, making no sound until Decker pulled back the quilt and she saw her daughter's face. The sound that stopped was replaced by a different kind of silence, the kind that falls when something feared has not happened, and the body doesn't know how to process the relief any more than it knew how to process the fear. Sigrid dropped to her knees in the snow beside the sled. She put her forehead against her daughter's chest. The men looked away. There are things that shouldn't have witnesses, not because they're shameful, but because they belong entirely to the people inside them. When Sigrid stood, her dress was soaked through at the knees. She looked at Wren, who had ridden behind the sled on Webb's horse. "You kept her alive." "The stone kept her alive." "You built the stone." Sigurd's voice held no warmth, no performance of gratitude. It held something harder and more durable, the sound of a woman who has just revised a significant portion of what she believed to be true. I told you the stone would never warm up. I told you it would eat the heat before it gave any back. A pause. I was wrong about that. She carried Marta inside. She didn't say thank you. What she'd said was worth more than thanks. It was a public correction delivered in front of 4 men who would carry it back to Ashford Bend, an admission from a woman who admitted nothing easily that she had been wrong about the stone. Within a week, 3 families sent men to look at the platform. They touched it the way Decker had touched it, with the tentative pressure of people who expect to be disappointed. The warmth surprised them every time. Wren answered questions from her knees beside the firebox, demonstrating rather than explaining. She showed them the channels through the clean-out gap, a candle in one hand, to make the smoke path visible. She showed them the clay joints, the air gap behind the wall shield, the firebox door that didn't quite fit right, the seal cracking slightly each time she opened it, losing control ere she couldn't afford to lose. She refused to draw a plan for any of them. Every shack is different. Every wall distance is different. Copy mine exactly and you'll kill yourself because your chimney isn't my chimney. She said it each time without apology. It was the most important thing she could tell them, and she told it the way Dot had taught her, once clearly without softening. Harlan Voss built his own platform in May. He didn't ask Wren. He worked from a sketch he'd made from memory while standing in her doorway on the day of the burial party. Dimensions, estimated by eye proportions, guessed the relationships between channel width and chimney height, and wall clearance reduced to approximation. He used salvaged brick, made the channels narrow to conserve material. Skipped the clean-out stones because a bricklayer he hired for 2 days said they weakened the structure. Set the bench 14 inches from the east wall instead of the 24 Dot had specified because his wife wanted room for the rocking chair. It drew in summer. It seemed to hold in early autumn. It was failing by November, creosote accumulating in channels too narrow to clean, smoke seeping through mortar joints on cold nights, filling the parlor with a haze that Voss's wife could smell, and Voss refused to acknowledge. His youngest son, Will, 7 years old, had been coughing since the first frost. A wet cough deep in the chest, the kind that settles and stays. The town doctor diagnosed chest inflammation and prescribed warmth, rest, clean air. Warmth was the problem. Clean air was the problem. The parlor was the warmest room. The parlor had the platform. The platform was poisoning the child one smoke-laden night at a time. Voss came to Wren's door after midnight in early December. She heard the horse before the knock hooves on frozen ground, carrying the urgency of an animal pushed harder than the hour required. She opened the door, already dressed, the platform warm behind her, the night air sharp with the smell of coming snow. Harlan Voss stood on her threshold without his hat, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, his face stripped of everything she'd seen on it before the calculation, the leverage, the careful assessment of what a situation was worth to him. What remained was a father. My boy can't breathe. She could have closed the door. She had reasons that would have satisfied most people's sense of justice, every word he'd said in front of witnesses, the freight note he'd used as leverage, the argument he'd made against sending a rescue party when she was trapped in the storm with another man's child. She thought instead of Dot Marsh, who had walked 3 miles in the cold to teach a woman she didn't know, because the woman was building something wrong that might kill her. Dot hadn't asked whether Wren deserved help. The question Dot had answered was simpler and more important. The boy was 7 years old. The boy was not his father. Wren picked up her iron bar and her clay bucket. Show me where. She walked into Voss's parlor and knew within 10 seconds what she was dealing with. The smell of creosote smoke, thin but persistent. The joint seepage visible as discoloration along the bench's upper mortar lines. The wall behind the bench warm to her touch through the plaster at a distance of 14 inches. She tapped the channel locations with the bar. At both turns, dead sound. No resonance. No hollow space. Both channels narrowed to the point of functional failure. You have no clean-out access. She looked at the bench. I need to open the wall here and here. She pointed to the brick face at each turn location. That's my heater. I built it. Voss's voice held the particular resistance of a man who has constructed something with his own hands and is being told the construction is killing his son. It's poisoning your son. The channels are clogged with creosote. The smoke has been leaking into this room every time you've run a hot fire for the past 2 months. Will has been sleeping in it. She said it without raising her voice the way Dot would have said it, as a fact stated, once not argued. You can discuss who built what after the boy can breathe. Right now I need to open these channels. Decker arrived through the front door. Voss's wife had sent their oldest boy to fetch him before Voss rode out, understanding that her husband would need someone else's authority to make him stand aside. Let her work, Harlan. Not a request. Voss looked at Decker, looked at Wren, looked at the bedroom door where his wife stood, and behind it came the sound of his son's cough in the dark, persistent, exhausted. He stepped back. Wren struck the brick face at the first turn. The second blow opened a fist-sized hole, and a plug of compacted creosote fell out, black tar dents, the accumulation of months in a channel that had never been designed to be cleaned. She worked through both turns, cleared both channels, packed removable stone cleanouts into the breaches using shaped brick fragments seated in clay so they could be accessed without demolition. She moved to the wall, confirmed the plaster damage, a yellow-brown heat stain climbing from the bench height toward the ceiling. This wall will ignite before spring if the bench stays at 14 inches. Move it back 10 more, build a clay shield with an air gap between the shield and the boards. I'll show you how. She heated bricks on the parlor's iron backup stove, wrapped them in cloth, carried them to the bedroom. 2 at the boy's feet, 1 against his ribs. She cracked the window, a finger's width cold air entering, smoke residue leaving. Clean air first, warmth second. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She picked up her tools, walked out into the December night, rode Voss's horse back to her own claim, because he hadn't offered and she hadn't asked. Will Voss's cough broke within 2 days. The fever followed it down by the end of the week. At the next town meeting, Voss stood before the men who bought his cordwood and trusted his winter judgment, and he said what it cost him to say. I built a heating bench in my parlor without consulting Mrs. Calloway. It nearly killed my son. The channels were too narrow. There were no cleanouts. The bench was too close to the wall. I didn't know any of that because I didn't ask. He let that settle. Then do it her way or don't do it. That's what I've learned. He sat down. He did not look at Wren when he sat. As for Daniel's freight note, the $31 that had sat in Voss's ledger like a seed since November, Voss wrote it off that same week without announcement, recorded it in his books as unrecoverable, and closed the account. He didn't mention it to Wren. She heard about it from the general store owner who handled freight records. It was not generosity. It was the calculation of a practical man who had decided that the cost of holding that particular piece of paper was higher than the cost of releasing it. The silence that followed his town meeting speech wasn't agreement or sympathy. It was a community recalibrating, reassessing who knew what, who could be trusted, what the cost of pride looked like when it came due. The authority had moved, and everyone in the room felt it move toward a woman sitting in the back row who hadn't spoken and didn't need to. Owen Pruitt arrived in Ashford Bend the following spring. He was 38, a widowed blacksmith from Kansas who had come to Nebraska with $60, a set of iron tools, and a draft horse that had bitten the auctioneer at his bankruptcy sale, which was how he'd managed to keep it. He heard about the stone platform in his first week because the story had replaced weather as the default conversation in Ashford Bend, the thing people said when they had nothing else to offer. He came to see it in April, not to learn masonry, but to look at the iron components the firebox door salvaged from a ruined cook stove too wide for the opening, the gap sealed with clay that cracked each time the hinge moved. The clean-out plates improvised from flat stones seated in clay channels. The damper handle bent from scavenged rod stock. Every piece wrong for its purpose, every gap filled with improvisation, every failure point one bad night away from becoming a real problem. These doors don't fit. He crouched beside the firebox, not accusatory, analytical, the way a man looks at a joint that could be stronger. Every time you open it, the clay seal cracks a little more. You're losing draft control every burn. I know. I can cast a door that fits this opening. Iron frame pin hinge latch that seats flush against a clay gasket you mold to the frame. No gap, no cracking. He measured the firebox opening with a folding rule, wrote the numbers on his palm with a pencil stub. I can do the clean-out plates 2 flat iron with a pull handle seated in a clay channel. You pull the handle, the plate comes out, you clean behind it. What do you want for it? I want to understand how this works. He stood looking at the platform. The iron I can build, the stone I can't. But iron that makes the stone easier to use is worth something to every family hauling river rock right now, and there are more of them every month. He wasn't flattering her. He was identifying a problem the way his trade had trained him to identify problems, by finding where two materials met poorly. She recognized the quality because it was the same quality she applied to everything she built. Not what is this, but what is this failing to be. The first proper firebox door he cast, seated against the clay gasket she'd molded to the frame, with a sound like a book closing. Clean final right. The firebox drew better immediately. The second test burn after installation held temperature 15 minutes longer per charge than the same amount of fuel had produced before. Their courtship happened inside the work, not beside it. He forged, she mortared. He measured, she tested. Sigrid noticed before anyone else. Pruitt had ridden 2 miles to deliver the door when his forge was 200 yards from the general store. Sigrid watched him ride away from the shack one afternoon in June and said without particular emphasis, "He built you the door first, before anyone else, and he rode 2 miles to bring it." She paused. "A man who does that knows what he's decided. He's just waiting to see if you've decided the same thing." Wren didn't answer. She ran her hand along the door's frame, feeling the even fit the clay gasket compressed uniformly around the perimeter. She didn't answer, but she didn't contradict it either. And Sigrid, who understood silence better than most people understood speech, walked back to her horse without pressing the point. Dot Marsh died that April in her dugout 3 months after the storm she'd helped Wren survive. The cold she'd carried in her lungs since autumn had finished what the winter started. Wren found her on a morning when the silence from the north had a different weight than usual, and she walked the 3 miles to be with her at the end. She buried Dot in the Ashford Bend Cemetery in ground that was finally soft enough to receive her, and she dug the grave herself the way she had dug Daniel's, because some things you do with your own hands so that the doing itself becomes a form of acknowledgement that words don't reach. What Dot had given her could not be returned. It could only be carried forward the way heat moves through stone, passing from one mass to the next, warming whatever it touches before moving on. In the spring of 1888, Wren walked into the land office at the Harlan County seat and signed the papers that proved 5 years of continuous residence on her claim. She signed with her right hand, the one with the scar on the inside of the wrist, a white line, clean edge permanent, the record of a night when she had held a clay seal against a vibrating pipe in the middle of a 3-day blizzard while the stone burned through to her skin and had not let go until the joint held. The land was hers, not Daniel's, not the government's, not Harlan Voss's. Hers, signed and recorded and filed 160 acres on the Stone Creek River bend, where the cottonwoods grew thick enough to cut, and the rounded stones lay in the shallows like something waiting to be useful. She had married Owen Pruitt 3 years earlier in the fall of 1885. Marta Holt had served as attendant carrying a bundle of dried hay twists in place of flowers, because Marta said that hay twists had kept her alive and flowers hadn't, and honesty seemed more appropriate to the occasion. Decker attended. Voss did not, though his wife came and sat in the back and left before the reception, which was held in the schoolhouse beside a warming wall Wren had designed, and Pruitt had fitted with iron components, and the room stayed warm enough that people removed their coats and stayed past dark. 6 families had heating benches by the winter of 1885, 12 by the winter after that. Wren walked every floor before she approved a single build marking layouts in ash, rejecting chimney locations too close to roof timber, refusing to draw universal plans. "Every house is different," she said each time. "What kills you in my house is what you copy without understanding." The community bake oven went up in the summer of 1886. Pruitt poured the iron foundation brackets. Wren designed the bake chamber above the firebox. The first Saturday bake drew 12 families with dough. The fire burned, an hour died, the stone held the heat. 20 loaves went in. What came out was bread that tasted the way bread tastes, when the heat around it doesn't vary, when the temperature stays even, because the stone holds what the fire taught it, and gives it back without hurry. Pruitt stood beside Wren while the bread cooled, not looking at the crowd or the oven or the loaves on the cooling boards. He was looking at the door hinge on the oven's firebox, which had dropped a quarter-inch on the left side during the first burn. "I'll fix that tomorrow," he said. She looked at him, looking at the hinge. The crowd around them was talking, passing bread, hand-to-hand children running between the adults' legs. He was already solving the next problem the way he always was, the way she was. "Thank you," she said. "It's just a hinge." "I know. Now go back to the morning of January 29th, 1884, and look at what the burial party saw when they rode up to that claim." Deputy Webb had stopped his horse 2 miles out because the chimney was drawing. Voss had seen it first and said nothing. Decker had seen it second and kicked his horse forward. They'd ridden the rest of the way in silence, the pine box lid scraping on the sled behind them, because none of them had words yet for what a smoking chimney meant on a claim where they'd expected to find a body. The door opened. Wren Calloway stood in the frame with flour on her sleeve, her right wrist wrapped in stained flour sacking, looking at the shovels and the sled and the 4 men who had come to bury her. Behind her, the warm stone platform filled half the room. On the shelf beside it, 4 loaves cooled in a row. In the corner, the cow stood placidly in the warmth that had kept 2 living things alive through 3 days of a storm that had killed livestock in open fields across 4 counties. The burial party had brought a coffin for a woman who was standing in her doorway, having just baked bread. That was the only house out there built for what came. Not because it was large or well-made or insulated or supplied. Because the woman who built it understood where heat goes when you don't stop it straight up into the sky, feeding nothing, and she had found a way to make it stay. The sled waited empty in the snow. The shovels went home unswung. The pine box lid rode back to Ashford Bend, still lashed flat, still unused, and in the years that followed, it became a kind of local shorthand. For the moment, a town discovered it had been wrong about something important and had to reckon with what that wrongness had nearly cost. Wren Calloway had not come to Nebraska territory to die in it. She had come to stay. She stayed. The land became hers. The knowledge spread from her hands into other hands, the way heat moves through stone. Not in a rush, not asking to be noticed through the long, patient work of material that has learned what it carries and where it needs to go.